What they do is they threaten the government, the secret government, that if you go to disclosure, we'll consider that a hostile act and terrible things will happen. We'll start sinking Navy ships and stuff like this. What they're also doing is they're breeding hybrids.
Welcome back. I'm here with Dr. John Brandenburg. John, welcome back, my friend.
Well, always a pleasure and honor to be on your show, Sean.
Okay, so last week or this week, at least in the last 7 days, there have been rumors right now that Muon has been hacked into. There's also again, this is all rumor stuff. I can't sure. Confirm or deny it.
Typical of
apparently the source or the point of origin of that attack was Eastern United States. You have Kirkpatrick out there just saying, nothing to see here. These aren't the droids you're looking for. No one's talked to me and showed any evidence. By the way, Bob Salas talked to him, right? So Bob Salas, nothing to see there is effectively, by implication is saying.
Sure.
And it feels very much like the Empire is striking back. My view is I'm just going to figure this stuff out on my own. The government's never going to tell me anything.
No, the government's not going to tell you anything.
I don't trust them anyway. So I'm just doing my own thing. And in order to figure out what's going on. Now, it appears that you still have kind of a whisper network. You have folks that you still talk to. And it sounds like, and again, anything that comes, we can't really confirm or deny it.
No,
it might be deliberate. Could be deliberate misinformation, disinformation. We don't know. You're just relaying what somebody told you. And I want to be very clear with that. We're not endorsing that this is true or not. This is what you're hearing. This is kind of the chatter that you're hearing from people who may be closer to the source of this information. The other thing that's important to note is you had a theory. And again, the reason I mentioned MUFON is you had a article you published in 1990 in MUFON magazine about a theory. So the purpose of this episode is you're going to discuss the theory, but it appears that this whisper network is confirming some aspects of that theory. And it might also explain why we're getting this. It seems like we were going gangbusters and disclosure, and then all of a sudden the Empire not only is starting to strike back, but it's almost cartoonish. You also have people on Wikipedia are going through, and these people, by the way, are led by someone who spent her entire career taking baby photos at a department store. And her people have been going on to Wikipedia and changing the reports of people who are, have PhDs, aren't calling them or deleting out doctor or removing their awards if they have anything to do with this topic. So those three data points, there is definitely a deliberate effort to shut this thing down. The problem is it's so ham-fisted and ridiculous. And by the way, Kirkpatrick gets full mainstream media coverage. The other thing for context, if you look at historical clippings, I just have to tell another story too. This is insane.
Tell me a story.
So on my radio show, I was going to have a guy on, and I'm not going to say his name because I want to protect him. And we were going to start going over, he has like an ingestion service, uses AI to tabulate all these old reports. And we were going to look at when's the most common day, when's the most common day of sightings, what are the races that are reported, so things like just taking the data.
That would be a very interesting study.
Well, because all throughout history, or not throughout history, throughout recent history, there have been plenty of local news reports, but at the national level, there appears to have been some broad blackout or whatever you want to call it. You never see these sorts of, or very rarely see these reports in mainstream media coverage, but you very often have seen it. Very detailed reports, very honest journalists that have been stretching back all the way to at least 1947, and before that, actually, in the 1890s.
Right.
So there's always been a deliberate effort. Right now, there appears to be a full court press, but it's very ham-fisted. Like the people who are doing it aren't very sophisticated. Like they're not very smart. So
it's hard to get good help nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is like midwit level kind of
right.
Of an effort. So now I say that, and it's very easy for anyway. Going back to this, we're going to do this data analysis, and the day before I was going to interview this guy, because I was going to interview him first on my show, and then I was going to have him on a radio show. He said, "I can't do it. I had 2 straight nights of nightmares," and then he wouldn't call me. He wouldn't talk to me.
Nope.
He wouldn't. So this effort is multi-spectral. Like there's, maybe it's just anxiety, but I don't think so.
I think somebody came and talked to him.
Well, or did something else. So you've heard of remote viewing, but there's also something.
There's a remote. There's other things that go along with the remote viewing thing.
So there's something that definitely go. And then there was another guy. He was a former or current NRO employee. His name was mentioned on a much larger podcast than mine. And suddenly, with Chris Bledsoe, and the episode was doing amazingly. And then all of a sudden it stopped growing. So when this podcaster called YouTube and said, well, what's going on? His minder at YouTube said, oh, it was shadow banned. It's just like, well, why was it shadow banned? And she said, I don't know. It's just my notes. And no, it was an honest answer too. She said, my notes say it's a decision made at the executive level. So our guess is that he mentioned this person's name and it was being distributed around a little bit too much. Sure. So it might be separate from this otherwise, other full court press. But, if I'm a little bit too aggressive or feisty, right, they can just make a phone call. And
it's funny. I'm obsessed recently with the last 200 days of World War II in Europe. And the German army fought right up until the last. I mean, they were fighting house to house in Berlin finally.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at Baen.com.
And when the Soviets would, of course, then you had the Battle of the Bulge, this big offensive in the middle of winter. The German army just never gave up. And it would counterattack, and they fought very hard, even though they were completely outnumbered and overwhelmed finally. And I see a similar scenario here, that we have a faction in the U.S. government that is going to really fight until the Führer bunker experience happens. And my own suggestion is that Congress pass a law giving a blanket pardon to anyone involved in this, as long as they will share all the information. Give them a blanket pardon, cut them slack. Okay, they were just following orders, a long-standing program. Okay, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let God handle.
I don't think that would even do it. I think this is about power. And I think
it is about power.
It's about power, and it's that these midwits think that they're able to handle it, and the average person is not, which is the most paternalistic, condescending, and ridiculous.
Well, knowledge, motivation. Sean, knowledge is power.
Right.
And power, once you have power, you don't like giving it up. And if that power is bound up in the knowledge of the whole ET situation, then you want to hang on to that power. And that means hanging on to that knowledge. You resist disclosure because the cover-up is the source of your power. But yes, but let us continue. Let's go back to the original thing where you talked about.
Yeah. So you're hearing things in your whisper network.
Right.
First of all, what are you hearing? And then let's delve into what your hypothesis was in that MUFON.
Okay. What I'm hearing is that the U.S. government, the core secret of why disclosure is being thwarted and resisted so strongly is that the secret government has been threatened by one or more alien groups that if they go to disclosure, this will be considered a hostile act. We could end up in an interstellar war. They're, of course, afraid of that. Not only would they all lose power, but then they would be in a war with somebody from outer space, an Independence Day sort of situation, or Earth versus the Flying Saucers, which I was just watching last night. Or there's another great movie, The Mysterians, made by the same group that made the Godzilla movies. It's made in 1957, shows women being abducted into flying saucers, bases on the far side of the moon, and underground alien bases and human traders, all in one movie. And when it was made in 1957, Japan was still basically under U.S. military occupation. I don't know if it was official or not by that point, but they were rebuilding their society along with American advice and consent. So I view that movie as required viewing for people.
And it's called
The Mysterians, and you can access it free on the internet. Just do a Google The Mysterians, just like the rock group The Mysterians. In fact, they were named after this movie. And it's 1957. And it's got these hot Japanese women being abducted into flying saucers, hybridization between human and aliens, bases on the far side of the moon, alien bases, the lavish use of directed energy weapons, not only finally by the Mysterians, but by the humans they're quick learners in this movie.
That sounds familiar, by the way.
That's right. And so
Havana syndrome and whatnot, right?
I recommend it to everybody as part of their education of how much the government knew back in 1957, roughly 10 years after Roswell. So what I am hearing is that the secret U.S. government, a bunch of unelected officials who are presiding over this secret treaty, the retired Israeli general who handled space security for them, has confirmed what was reported by John Lear, who formerly flew with the CIA, Air Force, Air America, that we had a secret treaty with one group of aliens, I guess as the Greys, and that this Israeli has now confirmed that, yes, we have a secret treaty. Now, apparently one of the provisions of that treaty is that the U.S. government maintains the cover-up. The cover-up goes away. This makes alien activities like abducting people much more difficult. People will be waiting for them with double-barrel shotguns on the ground, and everybody will get magnetometers so they can sense the alien spacecraft approaching and be prepared for them. So the cover-up gives free operating space for the aliens to do their hybridization experiments. We'll get into why they are doing that. But the aliens have apparently warned the secret government that they will consider it a hostile act, leading perhaps to war if the cover-up is ended. And one of the things that's going on, you notice there's a lot of reports of our Navy ships being swarmed by kind of alien craft. And that's a form of geopolitical intimidation. They're basically threatening to take out our ships at sea. That scenario, by the way, is seen in Earth versus the Flying Saucers. One of the first places the flying saucer beings, which are basically just the Greys in the movie, it's made in 1958, they sink a destroyer as an example to the U.S. government not to resist them.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
So the core secret, one of the core reasons for not ending the cover-up, could be that they believe the aliens, one or more alien groups, will react very hostilely and will view it as a hostile act if we end the cover-up. So that would give any reasonable person pause about whether the cover-up should be continued, at least for a little while. It would certainly induce paralysis, if nothing else. So that's the whispering I'm hearing.
Yeah, I actually think it would be advantageous, if all this is true, if there's a hostile alien civilization, it would be highly advantageous for them to keep this cover-up quiet, because I'm not even sure that this country survives the next year, in terms of the election. And I think the longer they keep this secret, the less likely the country will survive, because the level of distrust is so low at this point that this is their last shot.
No one trusts the government anymore.
Yeah.
They know the government is hiding something important from them. And the government is not acting, at least not acting in their own best, in the interests of the American people anymore. It's got some other agenda. Somebody was telling me, I'm getting slightly paranoid about the government. I said, being slightly paranoid nowadays is a sign of intelligence, I said.
Mm-hmm.
And so this may be one of the core obstacles to disclosure, is the threat of hostile alien reaction if we do. And I have heard the gray presence here at Earth, it is reported, the little short gray aliens, as a extraterrestrial threat whose existence is classified, is how it was described.
That's real nice of the government to let us know that there's stuff out there that's abducting people. And
I mean, Ronnie Reagan was warning us. He warned us 4 times, and I think part of what he was doing was he knew that the aliens were also listening. When he was basically trying to bring the public, he was basically preparing the public for an alliance with the Russians against the ETs. And I think the aliens blinked. And this, the Star Wars program was always about a space defense system. And they were sometimes a little vague about what sort of defense system, who are we defending against?
Well, there's so much misinformation out there now that, let's say this hypothesis is true. And I have to say that because there's an entirely other narrative that the Greys are our space brothers and they're here to help us out. But the question is what kind of a friend has to come under the cloak of night, abduct people without their consent? Oh, you agreed to it before you were born, right? Like if a human did that and used that excuse, oh yeah, I know I kidnapped you, but you said it was okay before you were born. Like people would laugh you out of a courtroom. So anyway, I'm angry, but I'm like, I don't know if the anger is justified, because the problem is by being so obscure and obtuse on this topic, right? The government is feeding all these sort of things when if people just knew what the truth was, they could make the appropriate decision. Right now, people will just be walking right into craft, and that might be the right thing to do, or they might be dinner.
Yeah,
right.
It depends on who's flying the craft. I mean,
right, but that's the thing.
People have been invited on board. There's several reports of people being invited on board by people who look basically just like human beings, and they're treated nicely, and nobody sticks anything up their behinds, and then they're taken for a kind of a ride and then brought back to the same spot and said, if anybody asks you who did this, just say it was the Pleiadians or somebody. And yeah, the one guy then reported to the Air Force his experience, and the Air Force officer who spoke to him said, you shouldn't be climbing on flying saucers, because some of these aliens are really hostile, he says, to human beings. And he says,
oh, really?
Well, these people were.
You know what? Why don't you put out a press release and let the rest of humanity know, dumbass? Right?
I know. I know. So we have an extraterrestrial threat whose existence is classified. And that same entity, that same culture has apparently threatened our government that if it ends the cover-up, there will be big trouble. And now we must look at this in the big picture.
By the way, without revealing too much, where is this information coming from? Like, is it from the bowels of the DIA? Is it from retired people who still have contacts? Just broadly, CIA, friendly foreign governments?
I think you covered it pretty well. I worked in Washington, D.C. for 15 years, so I talked to a lot of people. I heard a lot because of my interest in the planet Mars and the dead civilization there that was apparently wiped out by somebody. And that all happened before the dinosaurs. It just shows that in the cosmos, bad stuff happens just like it happens on Earth. That's all it shows, basically. But basically, I worked there for 15 years, and I still talk to some of the people who I worked with. And I wrote a science fiction novel where I put that fact in, that report in there. And several people who were on the inside read the novel and gave it very high marks. They basically, one of them said to me, "I'm amazed how many things you got right." He didn't specify everything but two of the people who were, I know deep on the inside said, "Oh, this is a great novel. This is right on." And one of them even called it War and Peace.
So why aren't we having uncontrolled disclosure? I mean, or not uncontrolled, it's called
catastrophic. Well, this disclosure is happening kind of as guerrilla warfare now. The cover-up is breaking up, and it is my understanding that several of the intelligence agencies in the federal government, and especially the Navy, wants the cover-up to end. They recognize it may have served its purpose in its time, but it's time for it to end and for us to face facts that we're threatened from outer space and we have to mobilize. And the other thing I heard is that the big defense contractors want the cover-up to end too, because they anticipate trillions of dollars for a space defense buildup.
Well,
Okay, to give you the big picture, by the way, why is this situation occurring is that if you look at the map of the stars, if you sit above the galaxy, it's like a old vinyl record with a big bump in the middle. Okay, we're out on the vinyl part of the record. And as it turns out, there's spiral arms like that you can see in other galaxies. There's two spiral arms. There's the Orion arm, and then it's called the Sagittarius arm. That's kind of towards the galaxy center and outward. When you look at Orion, you're looking at galactic out. When you look into Sagittarius, you're looking into the galactic core. We are on a spur arm that connects the two arms. So these bands of where stars are very dense, two lanes, we are on a bridge that connects those two, and we're almost dead center on it.
Yeah, we're on a choke point. We're on a choke point. Right.
And not only that, but locally, if you go down to a more 100 light year level, we are in this almost the exact center of a galactic void where there are very few stars. Apparently, there was a big supernova explosion where we are sitting now. It blew all the gas and stars, all the star stuff out of this region. So very few stars formed. For sort of in this big void, there's a wall of stars around us, dense stars, dense fields of stars. It's about 200 light years across is this void, and we are almost exact dead center in it. And apparently that is just a quirk of fate. We drifted in here. We weren't born here. We drifted in. Now, we're surrounded by this wall of dense stars where there would probably be a lot of other intelligent beings like ourselves. Let's assume that the Earth is not unique, that there are other intelligent beings out there. That's completely scientific. Okay, so we're surrounded by these walls of stars in a big circle around us. We're almost dead center in the middle of the circle. And we're visited by many different species, according to reports. Many different types of aliens visit here. Now, they're predominantly, if you do the statistics, I've seen is that 60% of the reports are of the little short gray aliens with the big heads and the dark eyes, or things similar to them. Then there are people who look just like us. Then there are what's called talls that are kind of like us, only taller, tall and skinny. I call them the Lakers. So many different species are visiting here. That means this region of space is not controlled by any one group. We're in some kind of neutral zone. So if you like borrowing the old Star Trek terminology, we're in the center of the Romulan neutral zone, apparently. That makes us strategic. We own Boardwalk and Park Place. We own it. And this is one reason we're like Luxembourg in the galaxy. We're surrounded by other major powers, but it's convenient to them to have this neutral buffer zone in the middle, and we're stuck right in the middle of it. That means we have not only enemies out there, we have friends. We have people who want to preserve that status quo. Just like Luxembourg survived, they want us to survive as being sovereign. They don't want any one power from the neighbors to dominate this place. So that means we have friends. And that's probably the reason our culture has evolved. You know, the Klingon battle fleet never assumed orbit around the Earth and informed us, good news, you're part of now the Klingon Empire. I mean, in the history of Earth, people would wake up in the morning and the French fleet is in the harbor. And the admirals are in the Sultan's palace and they've made a deal. You're now part of the French Empire. Congratulations. That did not happen to us. And it's because of apparently our strategic location that nobody was in the interest of nobody around us for one particular group to dominate here. So the people who are trying to dominate here, the Greys principally, are attracting a lot of hostility from the other powers, let us say. Let's say that is a reasonable assumption at this point. If you're Luxembourg and the Germans are trying to do a covert takeover of your government, the French intelligence, the Belgian intelligence, and British intelligence is also active in the capital of Luxembourg City, trying to prevent that. So, in the meantime, we've advanced very rapidly, and we have all this capture technology, which we are apparently successfully reverse engineering. We're becoming more and more powerful. And there's another historical analogy I like besides Luxembourg. That's Japan. Japan defended itself against the Mongols. And then what happened is the Spanish conquered the Philippines to the south, and they heard about, and the Philippines was a pretty poor place. It didn't, basically Stone Age tribes. Then they found out about this very rich kingdom to the north with beautiful women, lots of silk, lots of gold. Streets were paved with gold. The doorknobs were all silver. Just the thing. And these guys are veterans of the conquest of Mexico. You know, that was a big, big treasure house. Made Spain into the richest country in Europe, the conquest of Mexico. So they conquer the Philippines. It's a bunch of islands. It takes them a couple of years. Their dream, though, is to sail north and conquer this place called Japan. They get up to Japan, finally, the conquistadors, and they run into the samurai. And not only are the samurai very ferocious and willing to die on the beach fighting the Spanish, and the samurai have good steel, they're ferocious fighters, think nothing of throwing away their lives fighting invaders. And not only that, but they have gunpowder. Where did they get gunpowder? From the damn Portuguese. At the time, the Portuguese were independent and rivals of the Spanish. The Portuguese had arrived in Japan, and they were willing to sell the Japanese all sorts of stuff in order to get silk and various things. One of the things the samurai warlords wanted was gunpowder and muskets. So the Portuguese just sold them. They showed them how to make gunpowder, how to make muskets. They sold them a bunch of gunpowder and muskets. So when the Spanish arrived, not only were they facing the samurai on the beach with their big katana swords, But they faced ranks of musketeers. And once, even though the Japanese did not have cannons, they had a lot of musketeers, and every samurai warlord had a rank of musketeers because they were a bunch of feudal fighting barons at the time. Japan was not united. But that was enough to deter the Spanish and convince them that they could not conquer. Japan was too far away. It was too advanced. They had gunpowder, good steel, they had horses. And not only that, they were too damn warlike to conquer. And that's us. We have nuclear weapons, which is apparently the gunpowder, the great equalizer in the cosmos. We're far away from any of the major powers. We're in the center of the neutral zone. And we have nuclear weapons, and we also have acquired a quite reasonably a reputation for being ferocious fighters who will fight to the death. And all the movies we've seen from Hollywood, from Independence Day way back to the Mysterians and Independence Day, and then Earth versus the Flying Saucers, War of the Worlds, were always depicted as having ferocious fights with aliens from outer space and winning. So we are considered a tough nut. I will also say, and this is as a scientist, but I believe this very strongly. I believe it with all my heart, is that if the gray aliens could take this place by force of arms with reasonable losses, they would have done it already, but they can't. They're deterred by the other powers. The reason they're so interested in our nuclear weapons is because they're afraid of them. They know that it doesn't matter what your spaceship is made out of, what super alloy. If it gets it with a tactical nuclear weapon on the nose of a Sidewinder missile, it's dead. And so is all its crew. And you don't even need to hit them with nuclear weapons, apparently. They're not bulletproof, and you can knock them down with intense electromagnetic beams. Apparently, it jams their onboard equipment, and they crash. In fact, if you listen to all the reports of crash retrievals, some of them were apparently forced down because they had battles with other alien groups in the neighborhood, but some of them were knocked down by the U.S. and other militaries, especially the Russians. The story I heard in Washington, D.C. was that and this is kind of comical, what happened was we had Roswell. Mm-hmm. The United States knew because of an incident with Cape Girardeau in Missouri, mm-hmm. which Harry Truman trained at as a Army officer to serve in combat in World War I. But right after World War I, there was this crash of this craft during the Depression and at Cape Girardeau. And Truman was a Mason, and then Masons are kind of a spiderwork of intelligence sharing networks all through every society. So he knew all about what happened at Cape Girardeau, that they recovered alien bodies, and in fact, they had to go find a priest to give them holy rites. They didn't know what else to do. And the FBI showed up and Army intelligence. They gave them a good Christian burial because they didn't know what else to do, and carted away the wreckage. So then the government knew in its innermost levels about the aliens from outer space. And after War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells in 1900, basically, turn of the century, everybody was aware of the idea of aliens from outer space and that they could be hostile. Because that book was widely read. And people were seeing canals on Mars, what they thought were canals. So they thought Mars might be the abode of intelligence. All of that was common knowledge in the culture of any educated person in this country or in Europe. So the big picture is the U.S. government has known since even before World War II they were being watched. And at Roswell, most people are not aware of this, but people don't know what was stored at Roswell. All of the nuclear weapons on Earth were stored at Roswell in 1947 with B-29 bombers to carry them. All 5 nuclear weapons on Earth were stored there after World War II. And the gray aliens apparently didn't lose just one ship over Roswell. They lost 2 in the same night. Apparently, it was a shoot-down incident. The government had night fighters patrolling over Roswell. The night fighters, by the way, were P-61 Black Widows. World War II night fighter, 20-engine fighter, had 4 50 caliber machine guns in its roof turret and 4 20-millimeter cannons in the base, had enormous firepower, had a big radar dish in the nose that was made of fiberglass, which was considered a wonder material. They were based out of Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. And they were apparently doing combat air patrol over Roswell at night. We had jet fighters, but none of them could fly at night at the time in 1947. And one of the craft crashed near Roswell, and the other one limped along and crashed near Socorro. It was apparently tracked down by radar. The government was there immediately to recover it. They didn't even know about the one that had crashed near Roswell until later, till the rancher brought in the pieces. And they rewarded him by buying him a new truck, apparently, and telling him not to talk about it.
Yeah, he showed up. Yeah, he showed up in town. He disappeared for a few days.
Shut up, and here's the keys to your new truck.
Yeah.
So the big picture is that the reason the aliens are so interested in nuclear weapons is because they fear them. Nuclear weapons are basically the same cosmic power that powers supernovas. I mean, other than making a planet into a black hole, there's not much anything worse. You don't need to make a planet into a black hole to destroy it. All you need to do is a big nuclear weapon, it'll destroy it, as happened on Mars. So the big picture is that we are apparently in a strategic region of the galaxy and the local interstellar neighborhood. That's why we're visited by so many different species. That's why we are so much a focus of attention to all these people. And that's what also guarantees it deters any one power trying to take over. So then, if you are in a situation like that and you're one of these hostile powers, what do you try and do? So let's say you have your own equivalent of Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu says the best way to win a war is without any fighting whatsoever, not a shot being fired. Approach a walled city. Don't bring up catapults and dig a big siege. That's expensive. That takes a long time. You have this army encamped around a long siege. Plague breaks out in the city. They toss corpses from the city out of the city. It spreads to the camp. You have black plague raging in the camp. And Sun Tzu was writing also about medieval China. One of the reasons the Chinese are so big into psychological tactics is they're so vulnerable to them themselves. There's nothing like having a Chinese army waking up and finding out that your Chinese army has disappeared during the middle of the night, even though the tents are still there, because they've lost the will to fight. So Sun Tzu says the best way to win a war is psychological razzle-dazzle, intimidation, all of these covert tactics to get the enemy to surrender without a shot, put them in your army, and then you've got a bigger army, and you march on to the next city. So that's Sun Tzu fighting in medieval China. Razzle-dazzle and fancy tactics, you only fight when you have to, according to Sun Tzu. Fighting is expensive and inhumane. He was kind of a humanitarian of sorts. He says, gosh, fighting, you kill people and they're crippled and everything like this. And, it's just don't do that. Don't do that. Bribe somebody to open the gate at night to the city and come in and occupy it. No fighting. Like Al Capone says, just do what I ask. I'm a businessman, So that's Sun Tzu. The other art of war was written by von Clausewitz. He fought in Europe against Napoleon. He was a veteran of the war in Russia. And also he was chief of staff of an army that helped win Waterloo. He's fighting Napoleon. Napoleon is completely immune to psychological tactics. All he cares about is how much artillery does he have? Can he mass his infantry here? Does he have some good cavalry? That's all he cares about. He's completely immune. And you cannot win against Napoleon unless you are willing to endure heavy casualties. And in fact, you basically want to outnumber his army 3-1 to defeat him. And that's what they did finally. They had to arrange an alliance of the Russians, the Prussians, the Austrians to crush him at one of the great battles called the Battle of Nations that finally destroyed what was left of Napoleon's army after Russia. So, according to von Clausewitz, great outcomes require great battles. He's the one who came up with the term fog of war, the friction of war. One of his sayings,
politics by other means.
Politics by other means. And unfortunately, that's what a situation may be. Sun Tzu even, he says, you know, there's like 5 different grounds. And he says, on deadly ground, you just have to fight. You have to fight. Okay, we have the big picture. We have the Earth is strategically located. We're in the center of the Romulan neutral zone. That means we have people who don't want the Greys or anybody else taking over here. And then, of course, we have a bunch of... And what do they want to do? They want a quiet knifing in the alley in the middle of the night. They don't want a gun battle in the streets. If there's a gun battle in the streets, it'll bring in the other powers. One of the reasons the Revolutionary War could be rationally proposed by the American colonies because they had seen the British army defeated by the French in the forest. They knew the British army was not invincible. They also knew that the British had a lot of enemies. And they also knew that the logistics favored, if you want to sail from Virginia to Great Britain, it takes 2 weeks in a sailing vessel. But because of the prevailing winds, if you want to sail from Britain to Virginia, it takes 2 months. Half your troops on your ships die. 3/4 of the horses die of your cavalry. Half of your rations, flour and all of that, dried beef and everything, that goes bad in the voyage because it gets wet with seawater. So the American colonists knew that if they made the war last long enough, the British army was not invincible. They could defeat it on occasion. They also knew the British would have a very difficult time bringing a large army over to the American colonies and supporting it. And they also knew that the British had many enemies. So the war began as a war between the American colonies and Britain. By the time it ended 6 years later, Britain was at war with France, the Netherlands, and Spain, all at once. It had become a world war. They weren't just at war, and then they lost 2 armies here, at General Burgoyne's army, and they lost Cornwallis's army at Yorktown. And they just, the Parliament revolted. The Parliament had been kind of on the till for the King of England, and they just said, we don't care how much money you pay us. Lord North, who was King George's prime minister, when he heard that Cornwallis had surrendered, he just exclaimed, "Oh my God, it's over. We've lost 2 armies now." And the French had actually blockaded the bay where Yorktown was located, Chesapeake Bay, and they'd actually defeated the English in a naval battle. That had not happened for like 100 years. So, I mean, this thing snowballed. And this is why I'm advocating disclosure must happen. I don't care if the aliens are threatening us. If they want to go to war with us, that's their choice. They'll lose a lot of people. If the war goes nuclear, the Earth will only be a radioactive frozen wasteland. They don't want that. That doesn't gain them anything. They want to capture the Earth intact, and they want it done quietly. They want a Sun Tzu victory.
So how are they going to
How are they doing this?
They're going to do it quietly. And I think this leads right into
Okay.
Muon article.
What they do is they threaten the government, the secret government, that if you go to disclosure, we'll consider that a hostile act and terrible things will happen. We'll start sinking Navy ships and stuff like this. What they're also doing is they're breeding hybrids. And this was my hypothesis that I wrote in 1990. I said, why would somebody be breeding hybrids between human beings? Somebody is physiologically different. The grays are apparently more closely related to insects than they are mammals. So you're trying to take two very different physiologies and combine them. The results apparently are not very impressive. They're apparently sickly, weak beings. And so why would you be doing that? Well, you're trying to transfer the human immune system to this hybrid race so it can live on Earth. So you can colonize the Earth with these hybrids and replace the human race. That's what they're trying to do. That is what they're trying to do. And key to that is to be able to get a large amount of genetic material from the human race so you can develop a robust hybrid that can dwell on this planet. Mm-hmm. And how do you do that? You do a lot of abductions. And that means the government has to cooperate by not allowing disclosure. Because if everybody knows the aliens are coming in the middle of the night and trying to abduct people, they're going to sit up at night with AR-15s. The reports, by the way, are uniform in that aliens on the ground do not like being shot at and will run when they are shot at. They're not bulletproof, neither is their armor they're wearing, and they just take casualties. And so they want the cover-up to continue so they can continue their hybridization program to hopefully develop a robust hybrid that can then colonize the Earth and replace the human race.
How would they do that? Would they introduce those hybrids in a stealthy manner? Or here's
what I put in the novel that I wrote, Morningstar Pass, The Collapse. Their scheme is that the quickest way to transfer all this nice protein that we are, they want to take the protein expression of humanity and transfer it into the protein expression of gray hybrid in the quickest manner possible. They want to increase the hybrid population as quickly as possible, and they want to reduce the human population as quickly as possible. How do you think they would do that?
Through a genetic virus of some sort?
No, they feed us to the hybrids.
Oh.
The proteins that we are sitting here are basically originally, the atoms were originally part of chicken, fish, and beef. A little bit of rice and wheat thrown in, but it's basically the proteins that make us up are basically used to be part of the protein makeup of other animals.
But how can they do that in a stealthy manner without triggering?
Oh, the final stages of it won't be stealthy, but if they control the media, nobody will know what's going on. I'm sorry. Once you control the sources of information for society, you can basically tell them anything you want. As Lenin said, a lie repeated often enough becomes the truth. So the key is to maintain yourself wrapped in mystery and fear and have the government be a partner with you in silencing anyone who comes close to the truth. And therefore, you can achieve this stealthy takeover. So that is why we must have disclosure. And disclosure will be frightening, but just like the people in Earth versus the Flying Saucers and Independence Day, you'll just have to man up, I'm sorry, and face this thing like your ancestors would have.
Well, it's better than the current clown show.
Much better.
Where incompetent people are elevated to positions of power for things that have nothing to do with merit.
Also, knowing the facts, people tend to try and connect the dots unconsciously. But then if they come up with something that the government says is forbidden, then a lot of people are like sheep, and so it takes a great deal of mental effort finally to deny reality.
Mm-hmm.
Just ask the Germans in the last year of World War II. They knew they'd lost. It was apparent to anybody who could read and write their own name.
Well, but they also knew when they were fighting the Russians what would happen once the Russians took control.
Oh, and the Russians
lived up to it and did. And
they did.
Worse. Right.
And quite frankly, the Russians are the Russians. The Russians made war.
Literally, if you were a man or woman in Germany on the Eastern Front and the Russians were coming for you, there was no reason to survive that.
No.
Yeah, you would have been better off
at the same time
dying in place. Right.
It's at the same time, yeah, and I've heard that phrase, die in place. I talked to some guys who were just home from Europe. They'd been serving in the Armored Corps. They'd served on self-propelled 155 millimeter artillery, self-propelled. And they said they had been briefed that if the Warsaw Pact invaded, they were to go to the Fulda Gap and die in place. And they were all listening to this and looking at each other, and they said, no, I don't think we're going to do that. We're going to do a fighting retreat and live to fight another day, because Fulda Gap, we can hold them for a while, but we'll just do a fighting retreat. We're not going to die in place there.
By the way, that was my regiment's, before I was there, they used to be positioned in Europe, and that was their mission. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the Black Horse, they were to defend Fulda Gap.
Exactly. By the way, I followed the Cold War very carefully because I've always been my father was a combat veteran of World War II, flew on a bomber. All my uncles on my mother's side were in the combat infantry. One of them did not come home. He was killed in the last month of the war in the Philippines on the island of Samar. And the war was already over, basically, but the Japanese were up in the hills, were still fighting. And so he got
killed. They had that guy they found like 30 years later who was hiding.
Oh, yeah.
Philippines. Right.
One of my very best friends I grew up with, and I knew his father very well. His father was a very tough guy. He was a World War II veteran, combat veteran, and he was a National Park Service ranger. And he would go out into the hills on horseback and take samples of the trees and see which kind of trees were growing and what the forest fire. And he never talked about the war. And neither did my uncles on my mother's side. They never talked about the war at all. But I've learned from my friend that his father had, basically fought in the war in Europe, had met the Russians at the River Elbe. The war in Europe was over. They then put him on ships and shipped him to the Pacific, and he fought for another year in the Philippines against holdout Japanese. I mean, we're talking jungle fighting in the Philippines for a year after World War II was effectively over. But he was just stand-up guy, always a good guy, always enjoyed talking to him. And, he's a forest ranger, and I really respected him. He was a very tough guy. But yeah, that's what he did in the war. And then after the war, World War II did not end for him till about June of 1946, when they finally let him go home. And we're talking dirty night fighting, too. People slicing each other up at night, and flamethrowers during the day, and bayonets at night in between foxholes. But anyway, all I'm saying is that the human race comes from a long line of very tough customers. It's in our genes. We will do fine, I believe. In fact, I believe in all my heart that the future of the human race will look like Star Trek. That we will show ourselves to be very quickly. Once you know the truth and you can discuss the truth, it frees up an enormous amount of intellectual energy. Not only that, necessity is the mother of invention. I tell you, we are being kept in a kind of semi-dictatorship by the secret government because of this ET situation. Knowledge is power. They maintain power over us by withholding knowledge from us. But once we hear the truths, you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And there is nothing No one can fight like free people against oppression, liberty or death. I have been criticized, by the way, for saying such things about the end of the UFO cover-up. And I said, hey, I'm part of the military intelligence community. I've been there ever since I took my first security clearance in 1975, swore to uphold the U.S. Constitution against all enemies, foreign, domestic. And I said, I know my history. One guy said to me, well, human beings, we may be remarkably warlike. And I said, well, ants wage war. Ants and termites wage wars against each other, and they have soldier ants and soldier termites, and they kill each other. It's not just a human thing. I mean, apes and baboons fight all the time over the same water hole. Chimps fight each other. Different tribes of chimps fight each other. Why? They kill each other at a remarkable rate. So there is nothing uniquely human about waging war. Nothing about it. It is part of being a sentient being.
So how does this thing play out?
Oh, well, I had the privilege of writing a trilogy that began with the collapse of the UFO cover-up because of two women, two very brave women. One's Asian American named Cassandra Chen, and the other one is named Pamela Monroe. That's her stage name. Her real name is Elena Monashenko. She's Ukrainian and half Jewish. Her mother was Jewish in Ukraine, and they bring down the UFO cover-up, and then there's a war with the Greys. But as the war goes on, the human race gets better and better and pushes the zone of conflict finally out to the moon. We invade the moon. We land troops on the front side of the moon, and they advance back to the far side to besiege the alien bases back there. By this time, other powers have joined. It becomes a full interstellar war. And finally, with the combination of human ingenuity, ability to assimilate captured technology, human ferocity and valor, and the help of friendly ETs, the Greys are driven out of the solar system. It's a complete disaster for them. It turns out they're the scum of the galaxy. Everyone hates them, and they're at war with some other group, and they basically weaken themselves so much fighting the humans. The solar system becomes the kind of the Russian front for the Greys, and they lose their right arm right up to the shoulder here, and they can't recover. They're eventually destroyed by another race because they weakened themselves so much fighting us. So I foresee I looked at a worst case scenario. The best case scenario is we end disclosure, and there's some adult supervision somewhere amongst the hostile species, and they decide they've upped the ante at this card game, and we have to fold and walk away. And that's what they do. They just evacuate. And that's a very highly intelligent thing to do under the circumstances. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we've captured all this technology. We reverse engineer it. We become spacefaring ourselves. We have our own warp drive, et cetera, et cetera. I already have a theory for warp drive. Other people have it also. I have a theory to unify gravity and electromagnetism. Einstein's theory of general relativity says you can bend electromagnetism with gravity, bending light rays. That's what electromagnetic radiation is, light rays. And in my theory, which Einstein was also trying to create, the unified field theory, unifying gravity and electromagnetism, he not only wanted to have gravity bending light, he wanted light to bend gravity, to control gravity with electromagnetism. It can be done. We've actually seen experimental evidence of this, which, by the way, the government tried to debunk immediately. Some people reported that if they spun a gyroscope with three-phase Tesla power, that it would lose weight if you spun it counterclockwise, but not if you spun it clockwise. We got money, repeated the experiment, we produced the same result. We repeated the experiment exactly as they published it. Then, in the same journal that published this result, that people saw this weight loss for the one spin direction, but the no spin, and that's a quantum mechanical effect, by the way. This bunch of people from the University of Colorado, the same place that did the Condon report, saying, move along, folks, there's nothing here to see. So, same people who did the Condon report said, we spun a gyroscope clockwise and counterclockwise, and nothing happened. It didn't change weight at all. What did they use to spin the gyroscope? Compressed air. They didn't use electromagnetism.
Right.
So they didn't repeat the experiment. It was a classic government, and by the way, rather ham-fisted, because when I read the refutation, I thought they used compressed air. That's not going to do this, They left out the electromagnetism, so we reproduced it. We got the same result.
So how do you think we're going to find out about this?
Oh, we're part of the process right now, Sean. Yeah. People are going to watch this. I worked in Washington, D.C. for 15 years, and I knew about stuff on Mars. Believe it or not, when I investigated Mars, I didn't believe in UFOs because the government had told me not to believe in UFOs. And it was kind of an unspoken message. I was a graduate student. Lowest form of human life is the graduate student at a big government lab. And I was basically told, Brandenburg, there are no UFOs, right? And I said, yes, sir. Please sign my thesis. My doctoral thesis, so I can get out of here and get a real job. Buy my wife a nice house. I had promised her a nice house. I bought her. I got my PhD. Got out of there, bought a nice new house. And one of the things I had to leave at the door was any talk of UFOs. And when you're completely dependent on people for your working fellowship, they're paying your paycheck, they're giving you a road to become part of the scientific establishment and make a good salary. You're a patriotic person. You believe what your government tells you. Then you just see things their way. And then, so I got out of school. Then I went to Sandia Labs in Albuquerque, and the mountains around there are very red. They look like Mars. And we went through a nuclear crisis there. It's called Able Archer, 1983. Yeah, I don't know if you went through it, but I did. It was a classified clash.
I would have been 8 years old at the time.
Oh, okay. There you go, Sean. Imagine you're at a government lab. You're working on directed energy weapons.
I don't think the rest of the country knew about it.
No, they didn't. You can read about it on Wikipedia, though. We were this close to a nuclear war. We were closer than we were in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And NATO had staged a big exercise, and the Russians thought it was a Trojan horse, that we were going to attack them in the middle of the exercise. So they put all their nuclear forces on alert. NATO saw this and put all our forces on nuclear alert. All it would have taken is one off-course jet fighter. We would have had a nuclear war by accident. And so just before that happened, there was the nuclear winter came out, that more people would die of starvation and cold after a nuclear war than would die in the original attack and fallout. And morale at the lab where I worked collapsed. All people would talk about was, gee, if there's a nuclear war, do I jump in my car and drive home and try and get my wife and kids out of town? Or do I just sit there and be blown up with them, figuring that's a quicker and more humane death? People would say that to me. Mm. I had resolved, by the way, when I worked at Livermore, we went through a minor nuclear crisis. It was the Polish uprising near the end of the Cold War. I was just going to get a cup of coffee and go out into the parking lot and sit there, because I figured that streets would all be clogged if there was going to be a nuclear war. I wouldn't be able to even get home. So I was just going to sit there, and we were going to be hit by 10 nuclear weapons at least at Kirtland Air Force Base, where Sandia Labs was. So morale completely collapsed. Then we got Christmas break. Merry Christmas. I'm singing in church, old little town of Bethlehem. all I can think of is right after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Herod's troops came and massacred all the kids, all the boys 2 years and younger. I mean, that's my mental state. I have a little 3-year-old daughter. I have a lovely wife, and I think we're all dead. The next time there's a crisis, by accident, we're just going to have a nuclear war. Earth will end up looking like Mars. Then I saw on a television program that they had found this face on Mars and a pyramid next to it. And it was over Christmas break. You know, we're all at home. And suddenly I had hope. I had hope because I said, if there's a dead civilization on Mars, then the United States and the Russians will cooperate and go to Mars together, and we'll discover this, and the Cold War will be over. I thought this will end the Cold War. So I suddenly had hope for the first time in years that the Cold War could end happily because of this stuff we were finding on Mars. Then I quickly found out that the people who'd found this on Mars were actually being pressured by their own management at NASA not to talk about it. But we formed an independent Mars investigation team. A guy named Dick Hoagland, brilliant guy, formed this group, and we investigated. We found out it was true. There was the face. They had 2 good pictures of the face. They had 3 good pictures of the pyramid, 10 kilometers from it. We looked at another place halfway around the planet at a similar site. We found another city with 2 faces, one of which looks a lot like the face on Mars, the original face. We'd done it. There was a dead civilization on Mars. And also there was apparently an old ocean bed. Both of these cities were apparently on the shoreline of an ancient ocean in the north of Mars. I actually presented a paper on not the face on Mars, but also on the ocean of Mars to 1,000 Mars scientists. They never get, but if you look under Wikipedia, Mars ocean theory, I'm reference number 1. But the Mars community never gives me any credit because they say if we give Brandenburg credit for finding the ocean on Mars, then he'll start talking about the face at Cydonia, and this other place has a cool name. It's Galaxis Chaos. The face at Galaxis. So, and unfortunately, we also found, based on the isotopes, that Mars was probably nuked by somebody. But that happened before the dinosaurs. I don't think the people we're dealing with now had anything to do with that. That was something that happened in a bygone age.
All right. It is the top of the hour.
Sean, it has been just such a great pleasure and honor to be on your show. I have another topic I'd like to talk about. It turns out I wrote another book. I'll just give you a hint. Richard Feynman won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1962 for his theory of, he unified quantum mechanics and electromagnetic theory. It's called QED, quantum electrodynamics. But before that, he worked with his thesis advisor, a guy named Wheeler. Wheeler was the guy who made the hydrogen bomb. Mm-hmm. He was the physicist.
Princeton. Right.
Yeah, Princeton. Wheeler and Feynman wrote up a theory where they found, very carefully doing electromagnetic theory, they found out that if you vibrate an electron, it makes radiation. The radiation goes out, speed of light, and as time goes on, this big sphere of light expands. But in order to make the equations balance, you have to have the reverse solution, that a zone of radiation is actually collapsing around. In other words, there's a wave that goes forward in time, but a wave that comes backwards in time. That means the future can actually talk to the past. And scientists do not like talking about this because everyone knows that's impossible. The future can't talk to the past. But according to the very precise theory of physics worked out by Wheeler and Feynman, it's never been refuted. It's considered a puzzle. and therefore scientists don't like to talk about it. You can have signals from the future affect the present. Not only stuff like Alpha Centauri. If Alpha Centauri fluctuates and it sends out a light signal that we pick up with telescopes, we know that happened 4 years ago.
Right.
But we can actually receive signals from Alpha Centauri from 4 years in the future. As it turns out, the two waves have to balance at each electron exactly, or else everything blows up. So there is a physical basis for prophecy. Anyway, always good to be on your show. And yes, disclosure must happen is essential to our defense.
Absolutely, my friend.
The defense of the United States and humanity. Okay. You have a great day, great evening. Thank you so much, Sean, for having me on your show.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, John.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.